It's a great day. Welcome to That's Great IT, your one-stop place to learn about IT ops by turning IT noise into insights and manual tasks into automated actions, powered by BigPanda. I'm your host, Craig Ferrara. Join me as I talk to tech experts and people from different walks of life, sharing great insights, the latest trends, and relevant topics about IT ops and AI ops. This is That's Great IT, powered by BigPanda. Guys, thank you so much for being here. We've got a great episode today. We're joined by Vish Nandlall, VP Technology Strategy and Ecosystems, Office of the CTO at Dell Technologies. Vish, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm, of course, broadcasting as I usually do out of the trapezoidal afterthought of an office that was added to the structure of my home in the Bay Area of California. Where are you joining us today?
Today, I'm broadcasting live from Ottawa, Ontario in Canada.
Now, our guests can't see, but I see a lovely background and a window. The window is a really nice feature. I don't have one of those in here, and I've got artificial lighting all around me. It burns my skin after a while, to be perfectly honest, but glad to see that you're able to join us from a nice office location with natural lighting. Hopefully it spurns some good conversation for us.
I'm sure it will. It'll hopefully help with some of my seasonal affective disorder.
Yeah, absolutely. So today's topic of conversation, tool sprawl. We've done a few episodes, right? We've talked a little bit, and you know, we kind of bounce all over the place. Sometimes it's healthcare. Sometimes we're just hearing a little bit about best practices and X strategies for handling large volumes of incidents, et cetera. But today, and you know, we can take this any number of directions. Today, we wanted to talk a little bit about tool sprawl. And what I'd love to do is, firstly, Vish, just to get to know you a little bit, tell us a little bit of your background and just your experience in working in IT over the years, a little bit about what you've done professionally, and then let's start to get into the nitty-gritty of what's happening in the IT operations aspects of tool sprawl. But let's start with you. I'd love to hear a little bit more about you.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Fredericton, New Brunswick, which is on the east coast of Canada. And as I was wading my way through the intellectual waters of life, I was trying to figure out what is it that I wanted to do. So folks who know me know that I'm just completely fascinated by reality. All the stuff that's in front of us that we take for granted, but we interact with on a day-to-day basis. I think the thing that always cut through everything was that most of reality is grounded on my ability to learn things and to talk with people and have conversations. And I quickly zeroed in on this notion that, you know, I needed to make communication better. I'd say I was socially awkward as a child. So trying to understand people to me was going to be the real way to uncover the reality, at least as a way of being able to survive. Whether or not it was objective reality, that's for another day. But being able to just understand how people perceive the world was important. So that led to a career in communication, where I spent a good chunk of my life in telecom. Started off at Bell Northern Research. I've always tried to be more so on what I would call the discovery phase of technology. I tend to be less interested when it's in scaling mode and sustaining mode. It's more about when things are still poorly understood.
Would you say you're an early adopter of technologies and things like that?
Yeah. I like the Simon Wardley model of there's pioneers, there's settlers, and there's city planners. It's debatable whether I'm a pioneer. I don't know that I have the research tolerance for slogging through a bunch of trials and experiments, but I certainly am a settler. I like to take foundations and then try to understand, well, how do I make this into something that reliably can address a problem? And that to me is a joyous thing to do, that period of time. Coming back to this whole topic of tool sprawl, I live in tool sprawl just by nature, because I've always been of the opinion that adoption of anything is a coevolution of both the practice and the technology itself. And so as people learn what it is that they want to do from a task orientation perspective, the set of tooling that supports that is going to evolve over time. And as those crystallize into something that goes from an okay practice to a best practice, that's usually where, you know, the sweet spot's had and the joy of that technology starts to take hold in the real world. So I'm very accustomed to tool sprawl, and I like to think through not just the technology, because that's obviously the allure, the compelling part of it. But I like to think about, okay, well, how are these things going to stack together to create an ensemble that then becomes a component of someone's day-to-day work life?
I love that you said practice and technology converge because so for everybody, Vish and I, we haven't met in person. We haven't worked professionally together. But Vish, I run a group at BigPanda called Value and Adoption. And we always say that you can introduce all the technology you want. We think the technology is there to do what you want to accomplish. But if you don't have a convergence of people and process with that technology, then adoption is always in jeopardy. And that's one of the things that battling is the wrong term. I'm not all for those warlike metaphors that you hear all the time, especially in the sales side of the house. We're going to take that hill. No, it's more just that's the challenge is
Exactly
people,
right.
people and process, the practice coming together to take in new technologies that enable new things. Change is scary. I tell that to my wife all the time, which is why I still work in a little trapezoidal hole without a window. A window could be added, but that would be a change.
That would be a big change.
So, that's great. Thank you for giving us a little bit of background. Tool sprawl, perfect segue, by the way. Let's talk a little bit about it, especially this show, That's Great IT. So thinking through things like IT operations and any aspect of it, whether we're talking about someone who's responsible for owning the budget behind providing a portfolio of tools that enable IT operations, someone who runs the IT ops groups themselves and are receiving these technologies. Let's talk a little bit about tool sprawl in general, starting with, how has tool sprawl from your experience evolved over the years? Where did things start and where did it start to get really hairy with so many technologies that have been introduced? Thinking back from kind of the start of your career in communications.
Yeah, I'd say let's go to a relatively contemporary example. I was at a service provider in Australia for a couple of beats. And this would have been back in 2014 when, I'd say, the furor around big data had taken hold. And like anything, the management team had decided they wanted to pour unicorn blood on top of their telecom offering. And the best way to do that was to build some kind of data infrastructure. Most operators are not unlike enterprises in terms of the problems that they have. The scale of these problems tend to be larger. This was a group that had different lines of business, had siloed data everywhere. They didn't have a common root ontology that unified it. So none of this data was portable. And so the task upon us was put together some kind of data consolidation infrastructure. It turned out to be a data lake at the time, which was the product du jour. And, we had to go through, in my mind, a fairly medieval task of taking data, modeling it, and then plunking it into a data lake and then into an analytics database. And for all the things that we wanted to do, which was let's do machine learning and start to build out an ecosystem of capability that could help to create scale and give us better access to insights, we ended up being a big business intelligence dashboard, is usually what happened. Now, in terms of the tool sprawl, we had everything, and it was all dissimilar from different vendors. We had a Green Plum database from EMC at the time. We had decided to use a Hadoop infrastructure that was from another third party, from Hortonworks at the time. We had a bunch of ingest tools that were taken from a bunch of different third-party companies because we had different cleaning that needed to do to inspect the data sets that we had, do the annotation on those data sets. And we had to have different visualization tools. So you had all these different things. We were constantly trying to understand across our data pipeline what was going wrong. Of course, there's nothing that orchestrates everything together. So they were all point-in-time types of correlations that we had to do. It was all manual. In terms of process, there was no process. We hired a bunch of data scientists and forgot that I needed data engineers and forgot that we needed, you had data scientists trying to put together the infrastructure. We rapidly realized I needed some IT folks and I needed people who actually understood how to build a data pipeline. I don't know that there was really a concept back then of what a data engineer was. It might have been more a mishmash of tasks. So we had IT admins, people who knew how to do and build networks. And I had to go into the technology team and find out someone who actually understood Kafka. And that was still a fairly novel pub sub mechanism back in those days. So everything was what I would call artisanally crafted. And in terms of observability, we didn't really even talk about that. Observability was really the arcana of how the system worked. And that kept everybody, somewhat excited because if someone knew of a certain weakness, it was undocumented and it was in that person's head. And he got to wear the cape and walk in and solve the problem. I would say all of those things really arrested the program. It allowed for us to do cool things very quickly, but we could only do them on an experiment and trial basis. So taking that and scaling it into something that could be production worthy was not something that we were going to be able to do. They were far too brittle. Everything was hand coded. The project I'm thinking of that was the most successful was some knock operations where we wanted to identify repeat offenders at cell sites so that we could create a punch list of kind of failure modes that were recurring too often, that if we killed them or took them down, we'd be able to substantially improve our downtimes. And so that was useful, but it was still one-off, and we couldn't run it repeatedly. So those were some of the things that you can get successes. It's impossible to scale these things into production. They become really experiments. And then as soon as people retire and leave and they take their scripts with them, then there's massive holes and you're left with trying to fill them in and relearning stuff that you'd already learned.
Right.
So nothing
kind of like you can't even just throw people at the problem, because the people need to learn and develop their process in order to be effective. Adding more people doesn't add more effectiveness. It's really people plus time almost. It sounds like a very cumbersome and slow moving way of doing things, but there was no standardization then.
You got it. No standardization. The logic chain sounds like something you're very familiar with. Is once you have a process, you probably have many different ways of doing those different steps in the process. So you got to standardize on the one. To standardize, and you can start to automate. You can think of automating. And once you can automate, you can orchestrate. And suddenly the sun comes out and the unicorns start jumping. Yeah.
I like that. Okay. Thinking about then, you're building new things. You've got a bunch of technologies that are coming in because you're trying to realize a vision that maybe hasn't been, again, we're going to probably use the word standardization a lot today, but when you think about kind of a standardized way of building out X, whether it be a data lake, a data pipeline, having an understanding of the digital infrastructure side of your business, which is managing consumer data, access information, health of infrastructure, applications and service, all of this data all comes in. What would happen to your operators at that point? The people that were building and managing these data pipelines, what was the effect on them having so much going on that was all very custom, a lot of different tools in place? Nobody really understood everything holistically, but there was a lot of pockets of knowledge. What was the effect on your staffing at that point?
Well, staffing became very difficult because I couldn't hire for generalized talent. I was hiring for very specific things. Can you maintain these Perl scripts, or can you maintain? It became something that was more of an apprenticeship into these systems, and that's a formula for doom in the end. In some ways, this is something writ large that happens all the time. I always like to talk about the beginning of my career back in the 90s. If I wanted to design an application, I got some software developers, and maybe it was 4 or 5, and they developed the full application. Today, you want to develop an application, you better have a database engineer, someone who understands cloud stacks. I need to have someone who can design the actual algorithms, and someone who actually understands how to do different search optimizations. And there's all these different specialists that come into the game, let alone your data scientists and everyone else. That there's this complete dilation of talent that's needed because of the specialization, which has brought this movement towards no code and low code, and let's put a ton of underlying automation behind things to replace the scarcity. So we were at that point. We were at the point where everything was so specialized that the amount of people it took to do a small change, as a for instance, was significant. I couldn't update a schema in less than a week. So things like that, they start to become problematic because clearly when you show proof of value, which this was, people get excited. And like I said, you're like a little mini Google inside of our enterprise. You can do all these wondrous, magical things. Well, more people are going to want to do it. And then you get overwhelmed because certainly we couldn't take that capacity. We had no ability to be able to service all the requests. And so all that did was create friction in terms of the experience that the people had, because it wasn't coming as quickly as they'd like. And so people get disillusioned, disenchanted, and usually the end game for those types of reactions and sentiments is let's cancel that program. And money and budget starts to get retired, and they get allocated into other production-worthy types of projects. Those are the perils, I think, of that kind of experience.
So this is where we were. It was almost the Wild West when it comes to developing applications, support yourself mentality. There's not really a standardized way of doing all these things. So I know I need to, we have a need, hire for that need. We have this need over here now, hire for this need. You've got all these specializations. And a lot of this is because, low code, no code, these scalable methods of agile delivery of applications and services didn't really exist. From a tooling perspective, talk about how that's changed with the evolution of a lot of the cloud-based infrastructure, virtualization that we're seeing. Even then, also looking at the tools that are available for monitoring health, right, of these applications and services. How has that changed over the years? And even if you just want to just juxtapose what you just described with how you're managing your operations today, what is the big changes that you've seen?
Yeah, first of all, practices have evolved, which is a big fundamental difference. So we go to this Wild West where people have thoughts and opinions, all of which are subjective. And now we have ways that this is how you solve that problem, as opposed to having data from different lines of business that are unrelated to one another, that can't be ported from one group to the next. We started to evolve technologies like enterprise knowledge graphs or graph databases, which allow us to do semantic modeling. And that forces you away from, these hard-coded assumptions into more of a reliance on concept. So you move from columns to context at the end of the day. So there's a technology that comes in that becomes very useful. What happens when you have that? So now I'm seeing the evolution, much like others like Weaviate and other companies out there, that there's a new kind of little AI stack being created. Right now, it's a bit of a loose coalition of different projects, but you can see the stack evolving. And we're starting to use something very similar to this, where you need to have embeddings of some kind. So you can do data searches and similarity. And the beauty of today is you can go to places like Hugging Faces and OpenAI and get access to embeddings, or you create your own if you have a very specialist ontology that you're working with. Neural search frameworks exist. You can go to Haystack and others. Feature stores exist where I can store all these things. Now I can do vector search on it. So that becomes a pretty key capability in terms of being able to do my ML development, which didn't exist before, right? Before it was, let me go to Trifacta and do a bunch of data wrangling, and it was very difficult. How do I select the right training data that's going to give me the best performance in my model? How do I select what the test set should look like? How do I find mislabeled data? How do I find all that stuff was very difficult. Now I've got a consistent way of doing it that also helps me to leapfrog this problem of divisional data. And so we go from this Wild West to something now, okay, there's a problem. Here's a whole set of tooling because people are doing it in a consistent way. I think open source really accelerated it. So you do have a lot of different open source projects. What hasn't happened is this hasn't materialized into a solid stack. I think that's the next level. We're moving from the CEO of Weaviate, I can't remember his name for the life of me, has this beautiful way of talking about we're moving from relational to SQL to this AI first database. And this is now one of the solid components that's going to make both of the technologies and the practice collapse into a stack that's usable. And so I see that evolution happening. It's not there as yet. It's one of those things where it's a likely truth. This will happen. Being able to put in ML tooling that follows the evolution of this practice is going to be incredibly powerful.
So what I'm hearing too as well, when you start seeing how these different technologies are not just solidifying their role in the technology stack. So you've got these clear and cut options. You're seeing a simplification of the tools, a simplification of the tools that are being developed with. There's a lot of tools that are still available, but there's less custom or bespoke, we'll say, functions being deployed for service availability or service creation or application creation. So that people are pulling from a centralized source that's openly available.
That's right.
What that probably means then is that the tool sprawl itself still exists, but it's more accessible. And so that hiring for you becomes a little bit more easy because you have multidisciplinary engineers that you can bring in that can pull from this pooled knowledge set to assist them in their own development. So the tool sprawl isn't going away, but access to knowledge is becoming less tribal, being taken out of people's heads, and you have this pooled resource that everybody can develop with, so that developing is easy, even if there are still a lot of different tools that are available.
I like the way you put that. That is true. But there's tribal wisdom that's starting to crystallize. This is how you do that. Let's do nearest neighbor searches or use semantic computation. And this is the right way to do that. There's a bunch of other ways you could do it, but this is kind of the best, most general purpose way of doing it. And so people have started to get there. I think that there's something else that's happening as well. I do think that we've become more oriented around distributed services. And when you see microservices being developed, this understanding that there's multiple different components that need to be orchestrated, that we started to develop ways to address that. Right? How do I network between them? How do I do things like, for instance, open policy work that's going on in NCF, where you can centralize policy decision making and then you can delegate the actual policy execution into the multiple disparate systems. So we started to think through better how to coordinate these disparate tools and to try to stitch them together in a way where it's tractable, where I can actually get some sense making out of it. Which has been helpful. I do think that is something that didn't maybe fully blossom back, let's say, minus 10 years ago. I think we're catching up to that.
I think it's pretty plain to see tool sprawl exists. It still exists. And maybe we're even developing new tools that help us make sense of the tool sprawl or manage the tool sprawl. Developing with this portfolio of tools has gotten a little bit easier. Something like a CMDB, a config management database, it's helping map services all together for someone like an IT operator. Relatively new-ish, right? Especially the ability for tools to crawl your network, for example, and auto inventory things as quickly as they can, because your network might change over time, but no human can keep up with it.
Correct.
We're seeing continued proliferation of tools and tool sprawl, but from a human management perspective, is it getting better or worse to manage these things, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a difficult problem because you can get really specialized in it. And the more specialized you get, the more complicated it is. For each of these things that we're talking about, there's a trade space of different tools. You can go deep, or you can back out. And I think it depends on, from the project needs and the goals of the project, what's important for it. Is it important to differentiate on these things? Or can I back out and say, I just need it to be a black box function that reliably gives me this transfer? And I'll say I struggle with it in many ways. I know that in the big picture, the productivity of whoever I put on the floor is paramount. So these tools have to increase productivity at the end of the day. Just from a global perspective, there's less than 30 million software developers globally. And they're mediating all these applications, let alone the applications that I have. So there's just not enough to generate the number of applications that we have. What I find is, for the most part, I'm retiring a lot of the complexity and addressing it through the areas where I think is super important. We work a lot in edge-based applications today. A lot of my work tends to be in edge, where latency is the number one criteria, right? The thing that is motivating this edge is latency. And so I spend a lot of time on optimizing for the resources so that I have the slowest compute path, not the slowest, but the fastest compute path. And so we invest a lot of our time in that. But as it relates to networking and those other types of capabilities that are needed, I spend proportionally less time. I do those things. I might optimize the path, but that's about it. So it's a trade-off, but I agree with you. It's this fractal where I can go deep and it gets super complex, but there might be a big return, an outsized return in terms of a dimension I'm trying to optimize for. Or I can back out and get generic at the expense of some of that control, but it's good enough hygiene for the application of the project I have.
So Vish, just to back up a little bit, referencing what you had just talked about, which was you can get very much into the weeds and start to deal with how you're supporting, building, optimizing specific service areas and applications, or you can take a broad step back at the expense of maybe getting into those granular optimizations. A lot of our listeners of this podcast are IT practitioners that work in a NOC or manage some type of IT support team. And in some cases, they do have very narrow service responsibility areas. But in other areas, we think of an L1 service desk where it's like, hey, anything from this entire side of our business is going to hit us. And success is we need to be able to handle the widest array of incidents and support these wide swath of services and applications and maybe infrastructure without escalating to the service owners who have that much more narrow focus. And so I want two questions as we round out our thoughts for the day here. The first one is, in your mind, are there any solutions to tool sprawl, tool rationalization project, for example? How would you go about something like that? If you start to see a proliferation that's slowing down development cycles, making support difficult, how would you address tool sprawl?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways. One is, how can I simplify the process? Can I remove tools? That's usually one of the first things we try to do, is to eliminate tools. And you can have some measured success with that, but it's not the only way. The other one is, are there better tools? And I do think that as we see some of these processes start to harden, can we get a tool that might be a little bit more encompassing? Can it integrate multiple different functions so that it reduces some of the complexity that we have for stitching different tools together? That's usually another particular area. Then there is the tool face-off. Are there just better tools that give me better optimization? So those are a couple of the methods that we use. You bring up this notion of the NOC, which is something that I'm particularly passionate about, because a lot of the stuff that we do is for NOCs and SOCs and trying to enable the operations and the life cycle of things that we put out.
I like that you brought up the dichotomy of tool sprawl, reduction of tools versus management or improving your set of tools, because it is very much reality that you cannot get rid of tooling in some cases.
You can't get rid of tooling. And in some cases, you actually have to add tools. The classic is security tools. The security industry is built on the concept of, oh, here's a great thing that'll prevent this. Okay, what can I get rid of? Nothing. No, this is additive. And the way tooling and security works is it's capped by budget. You just buy as much as you need, and everybody, is secure in the knowledge that you put 10% of your IT budget into security, which is, a little ridiculous, but it's the way of the world. In NOCs, though, what I find tends to be problematic is something called the street lamp effect. It's the old joke of, why are you might have lost something, you lost your sunglasses, and you decide to look underneath the street light, and someone walks by and says, why are you looking over there where you lost your sunglasses? And he says, where did you lose your sunglasses? I lost it over there. Why are you looking here? Because that's where the street light is. And the same thing in a NOC, right? You tend to look at the problem through the tools you have. And that itself can be an aperture problem, where you're conditioning yourself to look at a problem in an area where it's not going to help to diagnose or isolate. And that's where you do need to sometimes have different systems and increase the number of tools that you have. And that's always a tragedy when it happens, because you never want to add more. You always want to subtract. But that's one of the realities of the NOC. So there's not much you can do. There's really not much you can do.
One of the things to bear in mind, too, is that you can make these decisions based on available data. If you have, super simple example, if you have 5 tools in use today, let's take a simple NOC team that has 4 observability tools and a ticketing system. They're just feeding tickets in so they can see what's going on, ignoring all the systems and tools available for incident remediation. But if you are looking at your team's performance, quantity of incidents handled with a certain head count, in other words, my workload capacity, I'm looking at my MTTR, so I know how long it's taking me to handle by priority certain incidents. But there's a 6th tool out there that can reduce MTTR and allow you to handle a vast majority of more incidents with the same exact headcount, preserve budget in FTE, but handle a greater capacity at the expense of an additional tool. In my opinion, you are still addressing tool sprawl, right? You have a lot of tools available to you today. You have 5. In reality, that's probably 40, right? If you're an enterprise organization and you're the NOC. But adding one tool that positively influences your capacity to handle and support and continue to develop and take on new projects and improve process is as much a practice of addressing tool sprawl as
absolutely.
Tool
sprawl is a consequence, and it's a consequence of trying to get to a particular outcome. And the outcome is the thing that's important, right? You mentioned, if I can make my team more effective by adding a tool, that's important. Now, the discounting element, and I know you painted a bit of a prosaic picture, is the learning cycle for the team, because adding a tool always implies a certain level of training. And I always look at the curve as, you're going to be a little bit less than your peak with the other tool chain, but you have greater potential to grow. And it's what's that time, and then what's the cost of that time, particularly in a production environment where that becomes super important. The learning cycle for your team has got to be there, which comes back to your point that we spoke about earlier. If you're hiring a bunch of specialists to do all this stuff, their learning cycles are necessarily slower. It's a consequence of how it works. If you're hiring people who are a little bit more generalized, the learning cycle tends to be quicker. And that's just my personal experience. Other people may have a different experience with that. So where's the Goldilocks zone of the tools that you're pulling into the stack and the team that you're putting to man those tools? Because you need that agility to be able to add in things. Because again, I'm always driving towards, to your point, like what's ticket response time? How many tickets can I process in a given amount of time relative to the MTTR that I have as a designated SLA? Like all those things are important.
If we're closing out our thoughts today, again, 30-minute episodes, we may need to do a follow-up, to be perfectly honest, Vish.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed having you on today. But if you were to try to offer any sage advice to an IT practitioner who's listening to a podcast episode about tool sprawl today and potentially addressing tool sprawl, what's a closing thought you might leave our listeners with today?
To me, it's you have to understand what the goals of the project are. The tools serve the goal. If it's going to require sprawl, it's a sprawl. But you need to think through a number of different complementary things. There's going to be unplanned issues. Does your team have sufficient capacity to deal with those that aren't prescribed in terms of the regular day-to-day events? Because those are the stock and trade of most ops teams. They're dealing with unplanned issues. And how generalist are versus how specialized your team is relative to that tool. It's super important. The DIY and roll your own tool, I've never had good experience doing that. They become very brittle. You start to get locked into that tool. You cannot upgrade those tools unless you manage to have massive years of service and lifetime retention of your team. Go to specialists who build these tools and know how to do them, and then just put them through the battery of tests that you have for usability, and that's what you select. Far better to do that. If you're maybe a Google or an Amazon, maybe you have the luxury of doing that kind of stuff, but maintaining tools is just not worth the trade-off of building it on your own to get a very short-lived advantage. Those would be my general observations.
That's a great takeaway. And I think the only thing that I might add is where you can, take a data-driven approach.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
If you have great metrics on your team's performance, your time to production for new projects, and you can influence those in a positive way where you can make a business case for retiring a tool or acquiring a tool. Don't let the concept of tool sprawl create fear. Drive efficiency. And if that means tools increase within reason and budget and governance, great. If that means tools decrease, all the better, right? We can't always make everything align. Vish, I'd like to thank you so much, and we'd love to have you back. Great session today. That's great IT, everybody. We'll do our regular closeout as usual, but everyone, this is Vish Nandlall, VP Technology, Strategy, and Ecosystems in the Office of the CTO at Dell Technologies. Vish, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Craig. Pleasure to be here.
That was great. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. This has been That's Great IT, your one-stop place to learn about IT ops and AI ops, powered by BigPanda. Catch us on our next episode.